about an hour's time when we're using those breakout groups here on Zoom. But for now, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand you over to the very capable hands of Deirdre Garvey. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome. And thank you very much, Sinead, for that very practical and very capable introduction. I am just going to check that everybody can hear me or that I can be heard, and I've just got a comment that I can, so that's great. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deirdre Garvey and I'm the CEO of The Wheel. And can I extend an enormously deep and warm personal welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today for what is actually the final event in our popular virtual summit series, which has replaced and filled the usual slot of our annual summit at Croke Park. So our annual summit in Croke Park was scheduled for May 27th, and that clearly could not happen. So we did bend the space-time continuum a little bit, and we had session 1 on May 27th, and we've had session 2 and 3 in between time, and we are now finishing off practically 1 month later or 4 weeks later with session 4 in this series. So I would of course preferred to have welcomed you in person, but we're very grateful to have you in our virtual company today. And so far, over 1,000 people up to today, so in the first 3 sessions, over 1,000 people have been part of the virtual summit series. So, and I think we've all found that there are unexpected upsides to this way of strange and sudden strange way of living and working that we're doing now. So the engagement that we are able to have with our members and non-members and people from all different parts of Ireland has been significantly, in one sense, improved and enhanced, as we've seen just through the single event over 4 different webinars that we've been running for the past month. So the previous 3 events focused not just on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the community and voluntary sector itself, the people volunteering and working in the sector and the beneficiaries of our services, but it also engaged leaders in the sector about, in a very discursive and indeed challenging way in parts, about the sector's medium-term and longer-term future. So that was us, in one sense, talking with ourselves in terms of different organizations of different sizes and different parts of the sector in terms of understanding and kind of digesting what's going on around us. Today's event looks at the bigger picture, and we have welcomed both leaders from our own sector and indeed leaders from other sectors. So it's about where the sector fits in society. So it's stretching outside our sector big time into society and indeed the economy. After COVID-19, well, in one sense, COVID-19, when the after bit will come, we're not quite sure. We're certainly still in COVID-19, but indeed, the extent that we can learn from the community response to date and the way we've put, collectively as a country, we have put the common good above immediate economic or private concerns. So that's a really big issue that we are, I think, are only beginning to come to terms with and beginning to understand what that means for all of us in all sectors. So we are delighted to welcome such a brilliant panel of speakers that you'll be hearing from later on, and you'll have the chance to interact with them and also with each other about this big picture theme. So we have seen that community and voluntary action did definitely come to the fore during this crisis in a way that really showed its worth. We all saw that this vital resource, this really precious asset that we have in Ireland, it's always been there. It's been sustained by our sector, this community connection, solidarity, community cohesion, caring for the other. But it generally goes underappreciated and under-recognised in a structured way. Is it possible for us to maintain community in its new esteemed position in Irish society? Or will the post-crisis economic reality mean that we return to business as usual in the months and years to come? And by business as usual, I mean a sector that struggles for recognition and resources, trying to support communities while austerity measures deplete services and supports. We in The Wheel believe that there is an opportunity, if we choose to take it, to lead and to work in partnership with the political system, the public administration, and indeed the economic actors in this country. In this way, we can work to prioritise and properly resource public services and help to build an economy that supports and enhances them, and indeed helps to build a society that that creates and nurtures and fosters citizens and active citizens. Our public services and our community and voluntary sector came to the fore during the crisis, and we showed what we can achieve when we rally behind a common cause. And with sufficient will and effort, we can capitalise, we believe, on this solidarity to ensure that we continue to prioritise high quality, universally available public services and a thriving community and voluntary sector that builds and nurtures citizens and active citizens, not merely as units of production or labour or capital. Clearly, there's a need to ensure that we have a healthy economy to achieve this, and we are fully behind this objective. We believe, however, that it must be achieved in accordance with sustainable development goals and involve a movement towards a greener, more circular economy. And as with all crises, the COVID-19 crisis presents both opportunities and threats for society, and indeed in our case, for the community spirit, civic mindedness, and community cohesion, which are all encapsulated by and in our community and voluntary sector. Our panelists today will be exploring some of the questions I've identified here as they discuss what's possible for our society and our economy for the period ahead, and the extent to which we can work together to create a new social based on the solidarity of recent months. And my colleague Ivan Cooper, who will be bringing to, I guess, a close this series of events and the big picture and I guess inside the sector and indeed today outside the sector, the big picture thinking that we have done is being developed as we speak into a paper and a series of papers that will guide the wheels work and indeed hopefully build solidarity across a common platform for change in and across the community and voluntary sector. And he will speak more about that towards the end of the session. So with that, I'm just going to remind you that the event is also being live streamed on our YouTube channel. And if you're tweeting today, please use the hashtag Charity Summit. And again, just sort of a little bit of a housekeeping reminder, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras switched off. Technical queries should be directed through the chat function or merely just to say hello. And indeed, as the speakers speak, please email your questions to lucy@wheel.ie, because the basis of how we're going to run the panel discussion will rely on the questions that you email to lucy@wheel.ie during and as the speakers speak in that first part of it, because then we're going to go into a subgroup discussion, and then after that we'll have received your questions and we'll have sorted them out a little bit, and then Inez can get going with the actual interactive part of the panel discussion. So with that, and in advance, I'm not going to introduce the panelists, but I would like to really sincerely thank you hugely for coming today, for being here, for sharing your insights and expertise with us. And maybe for a little frisson of disagreement perhaps might occur, and I think that is all to the good. And with that, I would really like to, it gives me huge pleasure to pass you now over to Inez Bailey. She is CEO of the National Adult Literacy Agency. She is also a board member of the Wheel, and she is the chair of our public policy subgroup. So she will take it from here and introduce the panelists, and I will now follow my own advice by switching my camera off and going on to mute. And you won't be hearing from me again, so I'll just say thank you for coming, and please enjoy the session, and I will talk to you and see you soon, I hope.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you too can see and hear me. My name is Inez Bailey, and as Deirdre explained, I am a board member of the Wheel and I work for the National Adult Literacy Agency. And my job this morning is, apart from yourselves, to listen to some very interesting inputs, is to facilitate our three speakers as they give us some insights into the topic that Deirdre has outlined. As you know, the Wheel has been at the forefront in terms of looking at the area of active citizenship, and a recent publication, Participating People, in conjunction with the Carnegie Trust, highlighted some of the actions that could be taken to enable greater participation of people in society generally, in active citizenship, in democracy at the widest sense. So I suppose that sets, for those of you who had a chance to read the document, a little bit of a backdrop for the kind of society that the Wheel and organisations supporting it are advocating for. And I suppose this morning's session then is engaging with three very high profile participants who will give their perspective on that big picture agenda. I won't spend too much longer because I'm really keen to get them actually started. So I suppose just to say very, very briefly, there are three inputs. They will each get 10 minutes to share their thoughts. It's not a huge amount of time, so it's important that perhaps you all kind of get maybe one point out of what they're saying. But do feel free at any point in their exchange to put into the chat function any questions you might have, any comments you might have, because these will actually help to broaden out our debate this morning. In addition to that, then you will be going into the breakout rooms to sort of maybe further think through and talk through some of the points that have been raised this morning. And then we will come back and maybe just pull together some of the themes that have come out from the morning session. So our three speakers are Kitty Holland. She is the social affairs correspondent for the Irish Times, very high profile journalist in an Irish context and indeed beyond, and has had, I suppose, very striking influence in terms of Irish society, in terms of her cutting edge journalism in very specific social affairs areas. Then we will have Jim Power, equally well known, I would say, in terms of the media circles. He's the chief economist for Aviva Ireland, and no doubt will be giving us a perspective very much based on his commentary around how he sees the economy taking place going forward post-COVID in Ireland, and the implications of that, I suppose, for this big picture society discussion we're having this morning. And then finally, we will have Dr. Shana Cohen, who is the director of Task, an independent think tank that's very concerned with social change. And Shana will be drawing on some of their research that they have conducted in Task, and drawing on other research internationally to inform our debate and our discussion. So a very interesting, diverse lineup I think we have for this morning. Again, I'd really encourage you to make comments, ask questions, query, contest as you see fit, anything that you hear this morning, and then we will be able to take that up in the debates later on this morning. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to our first speaker, Kitty Holland, social affairs correspondent for the Irish Times, to provide her first 10-minute input. Thank you, Kitty.
Hello, hello, can you see me, hear me? I hope you can. Right, okay, well, I'm going to start. I'm just going to hope you can, yeah, you can all hear me. Right, okay, so I'm, as I was introduced, I'm Kitty Holland. I'm social affairs correspondent with the Irish Times. And so I'm going to look at this issue from, I suppose, a journalistic point of view, and from what I see covering the sector, and particularly over the last few months. And I suppose what's really shone through for me over the last few months of the crisis is how crucially important the work is that the community and voluntary sector do. And how really it's the public service end of it. You know, I sometimes think the term charitable sector or voluntary sector actually kind of demeans the sector and gives it less of a status than it should, because really, as we've seen so strikingly during the last few months, the crucial sector, the crucial public service that is done. And I was just looking through this morning some of the issues that I've covered, and this is just a small snapshot, but from organisations supporting LGBT young people, and the stress and suicidality that LGBT young people in particular have been feeling isolated, unable to get out to be with their peers, sometimes experiencing bullying and isolation in their own home communities, and how the huge number of calls that have been coming into the helplines. How important that work is in terms of just people surviving, I suppose, and getting through this. Again, as a matter of survival, the Women's Aid brought out a survey there a few weeks ago saying that they'd had a 40% increase in calls over the last few months. Again, I would say that they're providing an absolutely crucial service to women in domestic violence situations. That is not being provided, frankly, by the state alone, again, which looks after older people, has been running a helpline for older people through this crisis, obviously funded very much by the state, but it's been the organisation doing the work. And it has talked about, again, a rise in suicidality, isolation, loneliness. And they've been doing really crucial work in reaching out to older people, phoning older people themselves, and making sure they get the services that they need and they're not so isolated. Another piece I did was about the demand for free food banks, Meals on Wheels, doubling during the pandemic. Again, I would say a matter of survival being whether those services are happening or not. Another service I was at was the Mendicity Institution down on the Quays in Dublin, which was what I think actually the only homeless service still providing hot meals that people could sit down to during the pandemic, as most obviously had to close, and were providing takeaway meals. And again, an absolutely crucial service. And what they were finding was that the state run homeless services, which find beds for people who are homeless, on a night-by-night basis, we're stopping admitting newly homeless people into accommodation, or into homeless accommodation or emergency accommodation. And they were stepping in with things like sleeping bags, and a lot of their people would come to them, don't speak English. There would be Eastern European men who would be really, really stuck trying to navigate the system. Again, a really, really crucial service. And again, I would say a matter of life and death for some of these people. And I suppose what really, really shines through for me during all this is the fact that these services are doing work that is not being done by anyone else. That they are providing absolutely crucial public services. And again, I sometimes think the name charity actually kind of diminishes their role and makes it seem like a do-goody organisation that's, almost a hobby for people. These are really, really crucial services. And I do sometimes think that there's a sort of public relations issue maybe there to look at in terms of the word charity and voluntary sector, but that's possibly for another day. And I suppose the context then in which all this is happening is this crisis, and I think we're at a really pivotal moment now as we emerge from this crisis in terms of how the role of the sector is argued for, is championed, is publicised. And there's I suppose a moment happening now, and some might disagree with me on whether we're going to go back to business as usual or not, whether we're going to go back to a society being built by people who prioritise health building, the economy, whether there should be austerity, what kind of measures are going to be taken to rebuild the economy coming out of this, and who's going to pay for that, and who's going to benefit from that. And I would also say that there's more going on perhaps than just the coronavirus, and I think that's to the sector's advantage. There's definitely a groundswell, I think, happening around other issues like the climate change, the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, where equality and human rights and those kind of issues are really coming to the fore. And we really see now that people are not tolerating things like racism anymore. It's just not, it's just not tolerable. Women aren't going to accept sexism and harassment. Hello? Sorry, I thought I heard someone coming through there. so there is a context going on that is more than just the coronavirus. There is I really do feel it's a tangible shift going on in across the globe. I mean, this is going on from Seattle to Minneapolis to South Africa to Palestine to, you know, across the road. We saw protests of Black Lives Matter happening in Syria. So there is a moment going on in society at the moment, which if we choose to grab it and make it and marshal our arguments, or marshal the arguments in favor of equality, I think it's an opportunity for the sector to argue for how important it is. And I think it's up to the sector it's up to the sector to frame those arguments and to put forward how crucially important they are. And I think they're not pushing at an open door really in terms of the politics and the environment in which all that's happening. And I'll leave that there. I find into a bit of a vacuum, so I hope that all sounds okay.
Great, thank you. That was fantastic. And I'm conscious there is a bit of feedback, so possibly just remind people to mute their mics, please. And that'll help us, I think, with just a little bit of feedback there. But you did extremely well despite the sneeze. I just want to try and maybe just take out maybe couple or one or two sentences, just what you said, just to kind of wrap it up there. I suppose what I got out of that was essentially we have a context of recent very high profile activity that the C&V sector has engaged in that I think most people would recognize, as you have said, was crucial, was impressive, and perhaps there is an opportunity coming from that to make it something more permanent and more recognizable as a feature of Irish society, instead of something perhaps that was just seen as, you know, required in a moment of desperation, because as you say, a lot of these issues continue on irrespective of COVID. So is there an opportunity for the C&V sector to take forward arguments for a better position within Irish society, a more, I suppose, sustainable position in particular in Irish society, and voice their views at the political table? So I'm gonna close on that. I think that's been a very useful starting point for us, getting us thinking about the services, what they're doing, how well they've done, I suppose. But really, the point really is there an opportunity for change here for the sector as a result of that? Thanks a million, Kitty. I'm now going to move on to Jim Power, as who I said is the Chief Economist for Aviva Ireland. So I'm just going to welcome Jim and ask him to start with his 10-minute input.
Okay, Inez, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I just want to, I suppose, take up on a few economic-y type matters over the next 10 minutes. What we've seen, obviously, since the beginning of March, from an economic perspective, has been truly without precedent. You know, never before have we seen large swathes of our economy effectively shut down. And that makes it different than any other recession we've ever seen in this country, when, you know, the economy didn't disappear, wasn't shut down. So it's been absolutely dramatic. And I never believed I would end up sort of commenting on the source of statistics and the magnitude of the statistics that I am currently. So it's a pretty dramatic shock to the economy. And I suppose if there is a consolation out of all of this, is that we are not alone. This is a global phenomenon. You know, the International Monetary Fund has described this as potentially the sharpest economic slowdown since the 1920s. So a pretty dramatic economic backdrop for everything else that's happening at the moment. And we've had a lot of debate over the last month in this country and elsewhere about the need to open up the economy to get things flowing again. But there is an incredibly difficult balancing act going on at the moment between preserving the health of the economy and preserving the health of the nation. And I suppose on one side of that debate, you have economic and business interests. On the other side, you have the health interests. And the problem, of course, is that both sides have a lot of right on their side. and achieving some sort of balance between the two is incredibly important, but it is also incredibly difficult. And every country in the world is finding that. We see what's happening in Germany and northern Greece, in about 21 states of the United States at the moment, where we're starting to see an upsurge in cases again. So it just shows the very, very delicate and difficult balancing act, trying to restore the health of the economy while at the same time trying to preserve the health of the nation. There was a mention made by two previous speakers about this whole debate about society and economy. And I often think that this whole debate and argument is described in a very binary fashion. This is not binary. I mean, society and economy are both incredibly important. And economists are very frequently accused of being obsessed with economy, having no interest in society. I would dispute that, certainly from a personal perspective. But I think, to me, the bottom line is that unless you have a functioning economy, you will not generate the resources to create a functioning society. So I think one of the basic building blocks is to build an economy that generates the resources that will then be utilized to create a society. So you cannot have one without the other. So people who believe that economists are obsessed with the economy argument, I think, are missing the point. As I say, this is not a binary argument. You need an economy to create a functioning society. Of course, the big economic question is, how you actually allocate the resources that the economy generates to achieve the best possible outcome. Lots of challenges coming out of COVID-19, and I suppose a lot of these challenges actually exacerbate pressures that were already in the system. The implications for the public finances are pretty dramatic. We saw in the year to May, the deficit was 6 billion higher than the same period last year. And the story is going to be worse when we get the June data, because we've seen massive increase in expenditure on social protection, on health particularly. And at the same time, we've seen a sharp decline in some elements of the tax revenues. So serious implications for the public finances. And I think we will be facing into an environment where over the next couple of years at least, Ireland will have very, very significant budget deficits. And the question is, I suppose, how we deal with those deficits. And I'll get to that in a second. I think another outcome from the current crisis is that, in my view, it is going to exacerbate the whole inequality situation here in this country and indeed around the world, because those who have been most adversely affected by COVID-19 and the economic shock are typically those in relatively low paid jobs with relatively low levels of skills, whereas the upper echelons of the labour market, at least in terms of earning and so on, have been largely unscathed by what's going on at the moment. So I think we are definitely left with the spectre of increased inequality. And indeed, the legacy of unemployment we will be left with over the next couple of years will definitely be targeted on lower income and lower skilled workers. So that's obviously a problem. There's been a lot of talk about the community spirit that COVID-19 has generated. I'm afraid I'd be a little bit cynical about that. I think we've seen community spirit, but we've always had an element of community spirit. But we also have always had an element of society that has no interest in community spirit. So I don't see COVID-19 changing very much. I think human nature is what it is. People will continue to behave well or not so well. That's always been the way. I believe will always be the way. In terms of dealing with the public finance crisis that this is giving rise to, I would have that there's an assumption being made out there at the moment, and I think Kitty probably assumed that as well in her observations earlier, that this will be followed by austerity. It cannot be followed by austerity. There is no way over the next couple of years we can or should accept higher taxes, cuts in public spending to restore the public finances. We've got to try and get the economy growing as quickly as possible to generate the resources necessary, number one, to feed public services. Number two, growth will eventually reduce the deficit automatically. So austerity cannot be considered. I think a few things that we will need to think about coming out of this, and I suppose these issues were always there, COVID-19 has probably highlighted. One is there does need to be a much greater focus on the quality of life, because the whole debate really over the years has been based on the quantity of economic activity. The quality of that economic activity is rarely questioned. So, I think in the world of economics, there is increasing focus on quality of life as a metric that's worth measuring. And thankfully, although I don't believe it, but thankfully within the program for government, there is a commitment to try and develop some metrics around quality of life. I welcome that. Secondly, I think a debate that needs to start is the whole question about a universal basic income. And number one, the cost of that. Number two, the benefits that it would give rise to. So I think that's a debate that does need to start, regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with it. I think it's a very important debate that needs to be had. And I think a third issue focused very much on the audience here this morning is the funding structure of your sectors, because fundraising has been very, very seriously undermined over the last few months because of COVID-19. Every May, I do the Dublin Mountain Way for Barrettstown. That was cancelled, due to be held in September. I hope it will be, but I wouldn't be confident about it. I was registered to do the Dublin City Marathon in October for Barrettstown again, and that's obviously being cancelled now. I use personal examples there, but I think we've seen so much fundraising for the charity sector being cancelled because of COVID-19. So serious funding issues.
Okay, I think we may have lost Jim, or else he was actually at
Okay, can you hear me again?
Oh, we can.
Okay, I have no idea what happened there. Apologies. I was just about to wrap up anyway, as my 10 minutes is up. But I think that there is an assumption here that we do not spend enough money on public services. In the last couple of days, Eurostat has released a lot of data comparing Ireland's expenditure in a number of areas with our peer countries in the European Union. And areas like social protection, health, etc., Ireland is well up there in the European league table if you measure it properly as a percentage of gross national income rather than GDP, which is a nonsense in an Irish context. One area where we certainly fall down dramatically is in age-related social expenditure. We're way behind our European peers in that regard. But generally, across public services, the level of expenditure we engage in is well up there with our European peers. I think one of the problems we have is the structures that are in place for delivering public services, because we've seen a massive investment in the health service over the last 15 years, yet that has not translated into a commensurate improvement in the quality of services. So I would love to see out of all of this, in an environment of much changed public finances and fiscal situation, that there's a much greater focus on the structures of the public sector needed to deliver public services. I'll leave it there. Probably covered way too many issues, but just to give you some perspective on where I see the world at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. You're bang on the 10 minutes, in fairness to you. That was very interesting. And I suppose a couple of questions I think we could leave our audience with. You've certainly identified the challenges. And if one of those is related to the funding structure and the sustainability of the sector, if we're hoping it's going to be stronger in the future, and we're already aware that there's going to be this huge funding issue, what do we do about that? Maybe some of the participants today would have some comments in relation to that. And I suppose my only kind of observation on what you were saying is the connection between that quality of life indicator point and your final point about the quality of how we feel our public services are delivering for us as citizens, because they do seem rather connected. And I am aware that prior to the draft programme for government, one of our government departments was actually in train with looking at these quality indicators, because it was actually advised by the OECD in a recent review that it is something we should be doing. So I'd be slightly more hopeful than maybe you are there that actually may come to pass, and I hope it does. So thank you very much, Jim. That was really fantastic. Definitely another contrast in terms of our inputs this morning. So our next contribution is from Dr. Shana Cohen. She's the Director of TASK, as I mentioned, an independent think tank concerned with social change. And I'm going to hand over to Shana now to kind of give her, as I said, drawing on her research and evidence base, her perspective on our topic this morning. Thank you, Shana.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate the invitation. And for those of you who don't know me or know TASK, as Inez said, we're an independent think tank. We focus on 4 areas: inequality, social inclusion, climate justice, and democracy. And can you just give me a heads up if you can hear me, because my connection's not that great. Just let me know if, oh good, okay, thanks. So all of those areas, I would say, arguably contribute to social solidarity. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is kind of in between the 2 previous speakers. I agree with a lot of what they have said, particularly about the argument against austerity and thinking about how public services are managed. I've actually lived in a number of countries, and I've seen like the UK, where they rely upon the National Health Service and how important it is, and how they manage on scarce resources actually fairly effectively, and other countries where public services have been left to decline, and I can see the impact on inequality. So as Jim said, it's not just the investment, it's also how those services are managed. Anyway, I'm just gonna start the presentation. As you can tell, I'm from the US, I'm from Texas. I just wanna start my presentation with a quote from, it was in the New York Times, from a public health official in Texas. And if any of you follow what's happening in the US, you know that the cases are surging there, and Texas is one of the states where they're surging. And the reason is because the governor and the state government, and I won't show my politics, but it's totally Republican Party dominated, the government has insisted that they open for business. So one of the public health officials was remarking on the surge in cases, which is corresponded with opening for business. And he said, it is really a matter of bringing workers and companies to the table together to figure this out, which is the tension between opening for business and the surge in cases. It's not simply a matter of companies being in with the government without having people's interests represented. And he added, this public health official, that Texans used to be really great at this. And that's kind of the theme of what I want to talk about today, is how do you bring groups that represent the people's interests together with the government, and then I would add the private sector. So in that sense, they're not talking about the private sector there, but it is companies that want to get back to work so they can earn a profit and pay their employees. So what's happened is not just indicative of Ireland as well. You have SMEs in Ireland wanting to get back to work because they are going to go out of business if they don't. A lot of them don't have enough reserves to make it through the next 6 months, which means all their employees will lose their jobs. And Jim probably knows this much better than I do, that the Irish economy is very dependent upon SMEs for employment, much more so than you would think, considering the role of the MNCs here. So taking that into account, I want to talk about 3 areas where I think the new government, whatever it looks like, should think about. And I'll just do a quote first from the program for government. Whatever happens to it, we'll know, I guess, by Saturday. The program for government states that the COVID-19 pandemic illustrated the strength and depth of community life in Ireland. The resilient solidarity that helped to withstand the pressures of the lockdown emergency was drawn from a deep community life and pride of place. So the program for government also calls for learning from this solidarity, which should serve as an article of faith in the future and what we can achieve together. So I'm just going to focus briefly on 3 areas where I think the new government, whatever its composition, should focus on in order to help not just, I would totally agree with Kitty. I don't like the word charity because it suggests that you should volunteer your effort to help people who are poor. It reminds me of the Victorian era in England, and I think that there is something to be said for rethinking the name and building the status of what we do. So I totally agree with Jim. We cannot go back to austerity. We have to take advantage of low interest rates, negative interest rates to borrow and to reshape the relationship between economy and society. Where I may disagree is the fact, I think you have to think about the relationship between the two and the two in tandem. One does not exist without the other. And you can't say we need economic growth in order to build society or to build social cohesion. You have to think about the relationship between the two. And I think if we thought about the relationship between the two, we would also understand how to improve the quality of public services, because it would involve more consultation with patient groups, for health services, et cetera. So the first area that the new government has to think about is the structural imbalance in the Irish economy. I mentioned SMEs, the proportion which is above the EU average and above the OECD average, I think, of the proportion of the labor market that is reliant upon SMEs for employment. And if you think about how they're doing, then you can get a glimpse of what the unemployment rates are going to look like unless the state intervenes. So the other side of that also is we have the MNCs down by the Keys, but we also have a large number of low wage sectors like hospitality and retail. And these have been the sectors that have been the worst hit. And the government's going to have to do a rethink anyway. But as part of that rethink, the government needs to reconsider their dependence on labor, which makes Ireland, which is exceptional in Ireland compared to other EU countries. If you look at other small economies or small countries like Finland, there's hospitality and tourism have a far fewer percentage of low wage workers. And that's one of our recent, the state we're in, which is our annual inequality report, talked about that. The fact that Ireland tourism relies upon a low wage workforce more than other comparable economies in the EU. And if you wave terms like the Green New Deal, or you talk about just economic growth, that doesn't mean that those people necessarily have jobs, or jobs of the quality that they had before, or jobs that will enable them to survive. So one of the things that the Program for Government mentions is Ludgate, which some of you might be familiar with. It's the digital hub in Skibbereen. And I'm mentioning it as an example because it's a community originated enterprise. It's a digital hub for young people in particular. It allows them to live in an area like Skibbereen, which has a lower cost than Dublin. What I think is interesting about Skibbereen and needs to be developed is not just to replicate digital hubs in other areas of the country, rural areas in particular, as a way to attract people outside of Dublin and create jobs, but it's also something that builds the relationship between community, local business, and local government. And that has not been articulated in the Program for Government, but I think it's going to be important moving forward in the brave new world where we live, because you have the pandemic, you have the climate crisis, which we aren't really talking about in enough depth, even though the discussion about the new government is about the Green Party. And it's talking about creating local supply chains and local jobs. And I think that is something that the new government is going to have to consider. How do you develop local economies? In order to do that, you have to integrate community representatives and community groups. They also need to favor, moving forward, companies, whether it's social enterprises or other models of worker democracy, that pay a living wage and that recognize worker rights, and that even consider worker shares in the company. So it's the government prioritizing or favoring those kinds of companies, so there's a sense of job security, but also fair pay, and to move away from the current model, which is too imbalanced. The second area that I'd recommend that the government think about, and this is based on living for 13 years in the UK while the government imposed pretty crippling austerity. And if any of you are familiar with the situation in the UK, you know that food banks have exploded over the past decade. I mean, it's fortunate that the Church of England in some ways was ready for this, because they've set up over 400, probably more, food banks, the Trussell Trust, which is funded by the Church of England. And it shows you the demand. I can tell you from Texas, I saw a striking photo in the Guardian of 10,000 cars lined up to use a food bank in San Antonio. And they were talking about how there were Lexuses in the food line. You could say, why don't you just go ahead and sell your car? But it's kind of complicated when you're dealing with a crippling economic recession. But it shows you that it isn't just people who are on low wage jobs who've lost their income. It's also people in higher wage jobs who need to stand in line at 4 o'clock in the morning to access food from a food bank. What I would strongly recommend for the new government is that you avoid basic needs becoming the core focus of charities. There isn't the same issue of hunger here in Ireland as there is in the US or the UK, but you do have a situation where you could next year be addressing just how can people survive? How can they make it from day to day or month to month? And you don't want charities dealing with that kind of demand, because you're going to probably be managing on scarcer resources, and you'll have soaring demand for people who are very vulnerable and marginalized and who aren't used to it. After the last recession in 2008, I was in the US, and there were people, middle class as there are now, middle class families who had never been in this situation before. And it's not, you can say, oh, I'm not going to feel sorry for them because they've had a good life. But if you suddenly lose your income and you're having to rely upon a charity to survive, it's traumatic. So you have the trauma of the pandemic, and you have the trauma of losing your job, and then you have the trauma of your status. So you don't want charities to have to deal with that kind of rawness, that to be their core focus, because it's all absorbing. You can't really think about the issues that Kitty and Inez and Deidre and Jim have all raised, because you're managing from day to day. We have a report on household debt that showed that in-work households, low-income in-work households in Ireland have the fastest rising rates of debt, and it's due to paying utility bills. It's not, they're in rental accommodation. It's not mortgage debt. It's just to survive. So if you add the pandemic and the recession on top of that, you know that those families are going to be facing a crisis of survival in the next 18 months. And I'll wrap up. But the third is, as Jim mentioned, and as Kitty has mentioned, the charity sector has, if we rename it, the sector has to be a better place to work. We have another report, sorry, I keep citing our work, on the care economy, which was written by Rob Sweeney. And he said in his analysis, and the report is due out later in the summer, people who work in home care or child care are overwhelmingly female, and that's not a surprise, and often migrant. And they receive, their pay is generally low. So what we've done is, there are countries like Ireland or Sweden, where you often hear about how great their childcare provision is. But what happens is that the sector, the childcare sector, the home care sector, they reproduce gender inequality, because it's women going into those jobs and they're not paid very well. So there may be jobs available for women, and you may have greater equality of labor force participation between men and women, but you have greater income inequality because the jobs that women end up doing are lower pay. So we have to avoid that also being the situation in the charity sector, which currently is the case, because if you look at like the Benefax 2020 data, people in the sector are paid less than they are in other sectors. So in order to address demand, it can't just be, okay, let's deal with the problems of the people who are beneficiaries. You also have to reward people who are doing that work, and you have to reward it better. So one is to think about pay and job security. Think about getting rid of the use of temporary contracts in the sector. And also the government should set up schemes that really encourage people to set up private foundations. Ireland is way behind other countries in terms of the level of private foundations. There are very few non-state sources of income in Ireland. If you, again, I'm going to use the UK or the US. Of course, the US is a much bigger country and the UK is a bigger country, but there are hundreds of private family foundations or corporate foundations that fund charity work, and they should fund innovation. It shouldn't just be to keep services going. It should be about innovation. Anyway, I will conclude by just saying how we're going to achieve all this. And I want to go back to what Deidre said. There has to be kind of momentum, collective momentum and shared language, but also getting behind particular policy positions and asking for greater data. The data on the sector and its impact is actually pretty fragmented. It's not good enough. So I think one of the things that the new government should do for the sector is to sponsor a lot more research. And that's not self-interested. It may sound that way, but I think it could be a lot of people participating in impact analysis of the sector and helping understand how the sector functions. Anyway, thank you. I'll stop there.
Brilliant, Shana. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. And I suppose, as promised, a little bit more drawing on the data, as well as actually Shana's own personal experience of living in different countries, which always gives us a little bit more flavour. I suppose that sometimes we think these are problems that are just in Ireland, but clearly not the case. So just before we actually hand over to the breakout rooms, there is an opportunity, I think, just to maybe go back to all the speakers, which I think we can, if we can see them all on stage, just to kind of give them maybe one last opportunity to make a comment, because now they've all heard each other's inputs, they may want to say something. I know, in fairness to Shana, she probably got that opportunity because I think she drew very heavily where she agreed or disagreed with the previous speakers, and also perhaps put a focus on this idea of getting a balance between economy and society. So maybe if that is a sort of a thematic area, we might go back to the speakers just to give a brief comment on a little bit more maybe on how to do that, because I think that was maybe a common theme coming through all of the inputs, that we're all looking for some sort of change, and that change being something that the C&V sector can benefit from, that it's some way contextualized against a rebalancing or a better balancing of society and economy, public services and their outcomes for citizens. Clearly harder to do than say, so perhaps we might just get, if we can get all of the speakers back on, we might just give them each 2 minutes to say a final point before we go out into our breakout rooms, if possible. And if not possible,
yeah.
You want to,
here we go. I think
we go in the same order. Do you want us to go in the same order?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind, Kitty. Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I actually agreed with quite a lot of what Jim said. You'd be surprised to hear. I mean, I do agree that the economy is important. Obviously, we have to have an economy for a society to pay for itself and to survive and to live. But what I would feel is that it's how that is structured and where the balance comes down, and the situation I think that we are still living with in Ireland, and which is an overhang from the austerity, which I do hope we've learned the lessons now. We're not going to repeat that, because that was the mantra of policymakers back during the bad old days after the boom. That we invest in people, and I think that's the argument that has to be made, that the sector, the public services sector, if we want to change it from the charitable sector, because so much of what the charities do is public service, and I think that's an argument that they have to make, that they have to push forward how important they are and how important you are in terms of what you do for society and what you do to empower people to participate in society. And I suppose it's about investing in that, and it's about arguing that we must have a more equal society. And I think that's where the sector possibly has to get a bit more political, and not be so polite in its engagement perhaps with government, and saying, no, that this is important, this is what people want. I think that the sector has to win that public relations battle as well, in terms of saying what we do is important, what kind of society does everyone want, and because it's the kind of society we want to push forward is an equal society, and talk not just about the work that they do, perhaps with homeless people or people fleeing domestic violence, or people who can't get access to good health services, to actually talk about the wider society issues about equality. And as Shana said, there is an issue about pay in the sector, and I think that is an argument that has to be made to government going forward, that we are a public service, what we do is crucial, that we need to treat people as we want society to treat, but we have to treat our own employees the way we want society to be, which is a more equal, better, empowering society, and that civic participation element. Sorry, rambled a lot there, but that's can't hear you.
Okay, maybe I will come in for a couple of observations. Shana, I'm not sure how you interpret what I said, but I very much said that we needed a balance between the economy and society. I said it's not a binary choice, one has to feed into the other. So I don't differentiate between the economy and society. One is as important as the other. The simple point I was making is that without a functioning economy generating resources, you will not be able to create a society because you won't have the money to do so. And we've seen over the last 15 years the impact that economic activity has on tax revenues. They're very, very strongly correlated. We should never forget that. You know, after 2008, when the economy started to recover, we saw tax revenues recovering very strongly. And that's what funded social expenditure and all government expenditure. And there is a view out there that the Irish governments do not spend enough money on public expenditure. I hear Fine Gael being described as a right-wing economic party. Well, if you look at their record in terms of taxation and in terms of spending, it certainly doesn't fit the definition of right-wing, because they have expanded spending pretty aggressively over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay, what we need to do, I think, is, you know, when you talk about quality of life and all of that, there is no coherent view on what we need. You know, there isn't a clear view out there. We haven't identified what we want as a society. And our political system certainly does not help that process. And when you see what happened on the 8th of February, you know, where political parties come out and make all sorts of wild promises that will never possibly be delivered, the people buy into that rubbish. Okay, so we need to sit down and have a national discourse in a serious way. And Sarkozy tried to do it in France, but probably wasn't the right person to do it, to try and identify exactly what we mean by having a high quality of life, having a society that functions. And there's no doubt about it, every economic study out there would show you that the investment in education is absolutely crucial. Reducing inequality, and investment in education obviously feeds into that, and I think it's probably one of the biggest enablers of reducing inequality. But you know, we've got to have this national discourse about how you eliminate or certainly reduce inequality. And until you do that, until we identify what we really want as a society, we're going nowhere. We're all over the place. And I suppose in terms of your sector and in the whole fundraising issue, as an outsider looking in, it strikes me that there are way too many organizations. It seems to be incredibly fractured. And I don't watch the Late Late Show, never did, never will. But I do believe that during the COVID-19 process, that there was a fundraiser done for charities every night, for big charities that soaked up resources from the rest. So, you know, there does need to be, I think, a centralized mechanism for funding all charities. But obviously, to do that, you need, sorry, I use the word charities, okay, and I know you don't like that word, but I'm a dinosaur, so I'll use it for another minute or so. But we do need to fund, to have a centralized funding mechanism. But obviously, to do that, if you're going to use taxpayers' resources, you need to make sure that the funding is put into structures that actually work. So that's it.
Great, thank you, and apologies, I was muted in my last segue for Kitty, so apologies for that. So this will be an even quicker segue. Just back to Shana very quickly, 2 minutes, Shana, just before we go into the breakout groups.
Thanks. So just to follow up with Jim, so I think that it's the relationship between economy and society that has to be articulated better. I did get your point that it's not, but you're talking about growth and resources available through taxation. Actually, I think there needs to be a lot of thinking now, and that includes representatives of communities providing input about the kind of economy we want. It's not going to be the same kind of economy we had. There's going to be a different economic structure going forward, partly because some of the sectors like tourism and hospitality are in bad shape, and it's not clear how and when they're going to recover. So I think that the community, the sector, has a role to play in the kinds of like local businesses that they would like to fund, that provide a sense of community sustainability, that help charities work. I'm going to use that word too. So I think there needs to be more thinking about it. Just to finish on something, there's a campaign going on in the UK, and it's a political campaign, but it's called Build Back Better. So I'm not going to forget about the politics. I like the term, and maybe there's something to be said about the charities working together on a campaign with a slogan about the kind of society that they want, that kind of vision has to come from us, and we shouldn't wait for the state to give it to us. And I'll just conclude there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was really fantastic. I'm really appreciative of your contributions, your efforts. I think that's been really stimulating. I've loads of questions myself already. So I'm very much hopeful that we've set the scene and provided a context for the breakout rooms to go off and have a good old Barney about what they've heard, what they think, what they disagree with, what they support. And I suppose maybe at the end, that challenge from Shana about can the sector itself build that campaign? And what role perhaps maybe would the wheel play in something like that. So I understand I'm handing over to Sinead now, who's going to set you up into your breakout rooms.
Thanks a million, Inez. That's great. Yeah, I'm just going to share a quick slide just for anyone who hasn't been involved in a breakout group on Zoom before, just to let you know how you find your way there. And it's quite straightforward. So in a moment, I will set the rooms up and send you a little invite, which will pop up on your screen looking a bit like this, asking you to join a room. And if you wish to join, please click on the join button that's there. And if you accidentally hit X or later, you'll find the notification down here on the bottom of your screen, beside kind of the share screen and chat and all that kind of thing. You'll find it in breakout rooms down here. When you're in the breakout room itself, you can unmute and turn on your video there so you can have a chat. If you need any assistance from me, you can click down the bottom of your screen. When you're in there, you'll have this little button to ask for help. After 15 minutes, the timer will be up and it'll be time to come back to the main room, and you'll just click on the leave room here to come back into the main room. So I will get rid of my screen there, and I'm just going to open up those rooms now, so bear with me one moment. Super. So I am opening those rooms now. And now you should all have that notification to join the rooms there. Perfect. I can see that people are joining them. If you're having any issues or anything in the main room here joining, please feel free to pop it into the chat there. And we're asking you as well to email your main observations from the discussion so far to our policy officer, lucy@wheel.ie. And just a reminder to keep the videos off and to mute when we're back here in the main room, just to reduce those distractions. Hope you all had some good talk in those breakout groups. Looking forward to hearing the questions that are filtered back in. Great stuff. So we have everyone back now, so I will hand back over to Inez. And I will, again, turn off my own video and mic. So thanks a mil.
Thanks a million, Sinead. Welcome back, everybody. And hopefully you've had an opportunity to debate and explore, debate, and maybe contest some of those comments that you received. I've just received a set of questions that have been emailed in, and I'm going to use them as an opportunity to I suppose, get a little bit more out of our very interesting speakers from this morning. So without further ado, I think one of the most kind of pertinent questions that has come through, which I'm going to go to the panel in the order again that we had this morning. So Kitty, Jim and Shana, just to respond insofar as they can to this point about, do we think it would be a good idea for this theme to be dealt with during one of the debates for the Citizens' Assembly? So if I handed that question back over to Kitty, what would you think of that idea of the Citizens' Assembly taking forward the debate about the place of the C&V sector and its more central role going forward?
I think it would be, because usually the Citizens' Assembly, I think, looks at constitutional issues, I think, usually. So I don't know if it would be a place, but maybe I'm wrong on that, but it's a huge issue. It would have to be honed down, I think, to, something like, I mean, there was a debate about socioeconomic rights being included in the Constitution. I think that would be a kind of a place to have that discussion. And I think the issue of the universal basic income could be definitely discussed at a Citizens' Assembly. I think there would be great scope there to go and look at that in quite depth about what it can achieve. And if there was a universal basic income, what need would there possibly be for the charitable voluntary sector, or how would it change that if there was, if people were empowered with a universal basic income to make better lives for themselves? Maybe some of the organisations that are at this table this morning, would their role would change and might be actually more policy driven and more and less the bread and butter issues. That's my immediate thoughts on that.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Kitty. Jim, any views in relation to the question on a Citizens' Assembly on this topic?
Well, I suppose I'll lay my cards on the table. I'm not a fan of the Citizens' Assembly. I think it's an anti-democratic process. We elect politicians to drive policy. But I accept that there is the concept of the Citizens' Assembly has taken off here. It's very popular. It is seen to have a role to play, and I would totally agree with Kitty there that there are certain things that can be discussed at it, others that is probably not the appropriate place. But the universal basic income is certainly a topic that could be top of that agenda. And maybe with all due respect to the audience this morning, I suppose the objective of all of this is to put you all out of business. that would be utopia, but we'll never get there, obviously. But I think it's a discussion worth having at a Citizens' Assembly level. But I would also like to see in the political system a much greater emphasis on social partnership. Back in 1987, when social partnership was introduced, the concept was a good one. Within a few years, it lost all meaning, and I think it became counterproductive. But I think you can have a proper discussion, you can have a proper social partnership when these issues are put onto the table. And, a point I made earlier on that I think should be central to this debate is to get a national consensus, if we can, on what we mean by quality of life. Is quality of life is very subjective. It's not a measure of happiness, because some of us will never be happy anyway. So I think you've got to accept that it is a subjective concept. But and I about 10, 12 years ago did a piece of work on trying to measure quality of life using more economic type metrics than the sort of soft social type metrics. I got widely criticized at the time for doing it, but I make no apologies, and I do it again because I believe there's a lot of attention around the world paid to sort of happiness indices. There's a lot less attention paid to those economic metrics that should feed into the quality of life. And it's stuff like waiting lists in hospitals, it's crime rates, it's access to education, it's access to technology, it's all of this stuff. So I'm rambling here, Inez, but I do think Citizen Assembly could have a role to play, but I would prefer to see more of a national dialogue that's more democratically based than the Citizens Assembly.
Great, thanks, Jim. I think that's very clear. Maybe just head over to Shana.
Thanks, Inez. I would agree with Jim and Kitty that a Citizens Assembly has a specific role, but it's not here. Like, I would have loved a Citizens Assembly about Brexit. That would have been great because it would have allowed for national conversation about what Brexit meant. But that didn't happen. I think that said, there is space for devolution of this kind of democratic engagement. So I would love to see at a local level or regional level these kinds of forum, something equivalent to Citizens Assembly, but set up like a bottom-up strategy where you bring people together, because the pandemic is maybe just one external shock. We haven't talked about the external shocks of climate change or, forget the recession. It could be that in a couple of years we're faced with a climate catastrophe, and we need to prepare the public. We need to make the public more resilient. And I think that has to be a bottom-up engagement. And that's where I would see the room for sort of participatory democracy.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shana. Okay, taking a slightly different direction. And I think we did get a few comments from people about the idea of the charity sector and that title. But one of our questions was actually saying, do you think that the charity sector could teach the private sector a lot in terms of crisis management, as the nature of our business is being very responsive to people in crisis? So, Kitty, any views on any lessons that the charity sector
keep having to go first. Well, I think one thing that might be, come from the charity sector to the private sector would be to have more women in charge, because there is an opinion out there that if women had been in charge of the banks at the time of the crisis, maybe the crisis might not have happened or have been as severe. I'd need to think more deeply about that. I'm not so au fait absolutely with the structures of the charitable sector, except I would assume but I may be well wrong on this, that there's a sort of a more democracy in the way they're run. I may be very wrong on that, but that's the kind of impression I get, and more responsive, I would have thought, to the people who are using them, but I'm probably wrong on that as well. The one thing would be possibly that there would be more women involved in running the private sector. I think that would be to the benefit of everyone, including those women and their children.
Great, thanks, Kitty. Yeah, it is a bit of a tough question, and believe it or not, there are tougher ones coming. So in relation to that point, Jim, any views?
Okay, Inez, I actually would agree with Kitty again. There's something wrong here, Kitty. Having more women in charge. I mean, the old joke about there was no Lehman Sisters, for example. If you look at the handling of this crisis, the countries where it has been handled worse, arguably, would be Brazil, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And all three countries have one thing in common. They are led by bolshy males who are just full of the whole male testosterone thing. Whereas you look then at New Zealand, for example, you look at the Australia likewise. So there's definitely a need for much greater gender balance in leadership roles. But in terms of crisis management, I don't accept the point that the private sector could learn from the charity sector. 99.8% of businesses in this country are SME, meaning that 99.8% of businesses registered employ less than 250 people. And of those SMEs, something like 40% employ less than 10 people. And believe me, those businesses for the last 3 months, and I'm dealing with them on a daily basis, have been managing the greatest crisis that any business will ever have to face in their lifetimes. There's no doubt about that. And I suppose how it all works out will become clearer from next Monday onwards, as many of those small businesses, particularly in the hospitality area of the economy, try to get back to life again. And I made a point in my 10-minute input earlier on about rising inequality, and the problem, of course, is that many of those SMEs just won't survive, and you'll have a lot of the workforce thrown on the scrap heap again, and we'll find it very difficult to become re-employed, and that just exacerbates the whole inequality crisis. So I'd be deeply concerned about all of that, I have to say.
Okay, great, thanks, Jim. And finally, Shana, any views on the charity sector teaching some lessons to the private sector?
I don't know if it would be teaching lessons. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but following on from Jim's comments, I think there's a lot to be done right now about coordination between particularly SMEs that look for local customers, or maybe their range of customers is pretty limited geographically, and local charities. For instance, like their ways that small farmers have been able to survive, or small business have been able to survive, is selling directly to customers, not through an intermediary or a store, and that they go on social media and they sell their products. And I think there's a question of how to market what you're doing for SMEs, but also for charities to help is to think about it again in terms of community. It's talking about what kind of community you want and how charities and SMEs can work together. Let's say the whole kind of skill redevelopment. Is there something that can be done going forward about charities offering training, or working with local educational institutions to offer training for people who are inevitably going to be laid off from SMEs? And that will require forward thinking about the kind of local economy that you want. And that's how I'd say it's more partnership going forward rather than lessons learned from one sector to another.
Okay, that's a perfect segue to the next question, because one of clearly somebody who's been listening to this debate is kind of saying, well, okay, we agree with this rebalancing idea. However, do we think that the level of business lobbying, which supports the individual businesses and their sector, is actually operating at the expense of both the economy in certain places and indeed social justice? So, do the speakers see mitigating the influence of business lobbying as an issue? Back to you, Kitty.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure how you can mitigate the the clout that the particularly very big business has, like Apple or Microsoft, or foreign direct investment. Just don't. I don't know how you can. It's up to government to decide, I suppose, how much notice it takes of the kind of level of influence, the level of economic and political leverage big business has is very difficult to overcome from a small charitable point of view. I suppose it's the job, I suppose, of the sector to get together and to marshal its resources, and, as was saying earlier, to grab the moment that we're in now, in terms of not just what we've learned from the COVID crisis in terms of community spirit and that kind of thing, but also what's going on, particularly with younger people, in terms of their views on equality generally, the desire for a greener politics, a more tolerant politics, less racism, less sexism, and to leverage that and to make the arguments and to amplify their own voice and amplify and do it together. I mean, I think there's, as I was saying, there's a sort of a political dimension to this, which I suppose this sector tends to shy away from, perhaps because of the funding and the dependency on funding. I often refer to how Pave Point, which lobbies for the travel organisations, got really clobbered, maybe it could be 20 years ago now, when they spoke up on behalf of a community of Roma migrants who were camped out at the M50, roundabout the M50 near the airport, and said the way they were being treated was appalling, and called on the state to do more, and their funding was absolutely slashed the following year. And we don't know if there's a link, but there's a suspicion that it was. So that's always there, that kind of having to slightly kowtow to government and to funders. But I think together, there's a moment that if it's grabbed well now by the sector, to make the voice louder and to argue for the kind of society which I believe you all want.
Great, thank you. That's very clear. Jim, any views on that question regarding the power of business lobby?
Well, I suppose I would have to put my hand up here and said that over the last 3 months, I've helped and am helping numerous sectors lobby government, looking for assistance the restaurants sector, the SME sector generally, the private bus and coach companies at the moment who are in deep crisis. So there are many sectors in deep crisis at the moment, and I think they've got to lobby government to make sure they survive and come out the other end, because we won't be able to rebuild our economy after this if those businesses aren't around. So, you know, I see a role for lobbying. Obviously, your fear would be that it's the massive companies with the massive power, the massive resources, their lobbying is most effective. But I actually think that, you know, for businesses, lobbying works in a positive way. Okay, there are negative aspects, but it does work in a positive way generally, because issues are highlighted, issues are addressed. And, you know, in terms, for example, of you know, they say economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And you know, I think it's important to lobby to make sure that policy decisions are taken that actually, that further causes that are not strictly economic, such as regional balance, for example. I think that's important. So I think lobbying has its place. The biggest enemy to effective lobbying is fragmentation. So if the charity sector, sorry, I used the word again, if the charity sector wants to be more effective as a lobbying sector, fragmentation is what needs to be avoided. Have a united voice. Charities should not be competing with each other. There needs to be a united front here. If there's not, I think, you know, government loves fragmentation coming at them, because they can then ignore everybody. So lobby in a coherent, united way.
Great, that's very clear. Thanks, Jim. Shana, that last point.
I think the business lobby, actually one of the interesting points I think about that is the fact that, like, I've heard IBEC and like the American Chamber of Commerce say that what they really want is a cheaper quality of life, that the Dublin is too expensive. It's too expensive. They have trouble attracting staff because the cost of living is so high. So there's something to be said going forward with coordination between business lobbies, and this is going to sound odd in the sector, but about sort of investing in society, because it's not just, how can you improve the quality of life in Ireland? It's one, the government saying that the cost of living has to go down or pay has to go up. Actually, relative pay here is okay. But it's more about sort of getting corporations to, again, think about investing more, not just in corporate social responsibility being volunteering, but also set up funding to try to help improve services. So if we want to call ourselves public services, the access to services, but also to just improve the quality of life in places like Dublin and outside of Dublin going forwards. I would say if you can't, there's not going to be any change to the corporate tax if that's, you're thinking about revenue, but it could be that especially the big corporations could set aside more money to invest in social issues and the quality of life in Ireland.
Great, thank you. And this is definitely a follow-on question, but I think it's a really interesting one to add to our dimension this morning. It's somebody talking about an all-island response to this issue, because we have people here from the north of Ireland who are participating in our session this morning. So what do you think an all-island response could bring to this debate? And maybe just to go back to Kitty.
Gosh, that's a tricky one, because there's two different governments, well, no government down here, and wasn't one for a long time in the north, but two different jurisdictions. I mean, I suppose the discussion can be framed on an all Ireland basis in terms of the kind of investment people want in public services and in the sector that is providing such essential public services. And I suppose there's scope, you know, particularly maybe at cross-border areas, Derry, Donegal, Fermanagh, and would it be Sligo? my border geography is not great. Monaghan and Monaghan and Tyrone. There's probably scope for kind of cross-border cooperation on particularly, you know, sectors and cohorts that need public services. I think it's really difficult though with two different jurisdictions and two different funding streams, and you know, the Northern Irish Executive is so dependent on Westminster for funding. So to be honest, I think, you know, there's certainly scope for kind of social solidarity from both sides, you know, and both sides of the border working together, but on things like women's issues and children's rights and gay and lesbian rights and that kind of thing, big social discussions. But I think from a policy perspective, it's probably quite difficult, I would have thought, to have an all-Ireland perspective on it, to be honest. I think just from a logistical and practical political impact.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Kitty. Jim, any views on that all-Ireland response to the importance of the CMV sector?
I'm muted here. Okay, I'm unmuted. I keep this very tight, Inez. I don't see the benefits at a policy level of an all-Ireland approach. You're talking about two different exchequers. You're talking about two different jurisdictions. So from a financial point of view, from a legal point of view, I can't see how it could possibly work. The whole solidarity thing might make you feel better, but from a practical level, no, I don't see the benefit at all. Two different countries.
Okay, great. And Shana, any comments in relation?
Again, pretty tight answer. I would say not. I think that there's a problem because they're two different governments, two different countries. But I think that there could be learning. Like, just to give you an example, it's something that we've been thinking about at Task, fuel poverty. There's not a lot going on in Ireland, but there's a lot going on in the UK. So there could be specific areas where there's innovation in Northern Ireland or innovation in the Republic of Ireland, and there should be more cooperation. And again, going back to that United campaign, there could be ideas that are shared across border that we should take advantage of.
Great, I think that's a very useful way of thinking about it. We're caught on time now, so I'm just going to do one last question, which is really asking you for one step, sort of a one point response, I suppose. So effectively it's saying, what would each of the speakers suggest as a first step to capitalise on this opportunity to reposition the image of the sector and secure a more sustainable role for the sector? And in fairness, I'll go back to Kitty again, giving you a second there to think about that one, because I'm conscious the disadvantage, Kitty, you've had throughout on the questions, you're getting them all first. So you've done extremely well. So if you had any idea, what would be the first step that you would take to capitalise? Because I think you've been really clear that you do believe there is a moment, or there could be a moment, and what would be the first step you think that should be taken by the sector?
Well, I mean, I'd be demanding that the wheel argue. I mean, I think from an individual organisation's point of view, I think it's really important that argue and demonstrate how crucial your service is and crucial it has been, and how, if it wasn't there, how bereft a certain cohort of people probably in the community would have been. And I know that to be true, how absolutely devastating it would have been for so many hundreds of thousands of people if individual charitable organisations weren't doing the work. I think that Hello?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Interruption, but we can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a first step, individual organisations should be arguing that. I mean, that's a kind of sort of PR thing to do, but I think that be finding ways and thinking of ways to show how crucial they are, and to demand that there be a sort of concerted, then leading on from that, campaign or public relations mission to capitalise on that, and to show that, you know, without the sector, things really would have fallen apart, that they're absolutely crucial to the to public service infrastructure in this country, and to demand and argue that they be put on a more sustainable footing. Going back to my point at the beginning about the whole image of the charitable sector as being a kind of cap in hand, not absolutely necessary but good to have. I think that needs to go. That needs to be really dealt with, that image, because it diminishes the clout the sector has, and diminishes its clout in policy making and society building.
Great, that's very clear, and I think there's lots of food for thought there for people both in the sector and in particular for the wheel, who definitely are involved in that campaigning work, but really do need, I think, the solidarity of all the sector behind if we're going to make that huge difference that you're talking about. Jim, any views? What would be the first step that you would make to capitalise on this opportunity to reposition the image of the sector?
I don't like, I thought I was muted. I don't like using the term a PR campaign, but I think there is a massive messaging campaign that needs to be engaged in. And that campaign, in my view, should have three objectives. Three messages. One is a united approach from all charities. So I go back to the point about fragmentation. Secondly, the messaging around the professionalism of the sector. And thirdly, and I suppose the other two feed into this, it is trust, restoring trust, because trust in many charities has been undermined in recent years for various reasons. So it's a strong messaging campaign. I repeat, a united approach, the professionalism of the sector, and trust in the sector. And there has to be a demonstration that all of the resources the charity sector gets, they will be used to achieve the ultimate objective, which is to improve the quality of life of those people that you look after, your clients as such.
Great, thanks Jim. And Shana?
I think I'm going to end up echoing the Kitty and Jim, but I think that the first step is actually to demonstrate impact, and that will engender trust. I think that there's, again, too little data on what the sector does. Somebody suggested to me to use the term nonprofit, which is a very American term, because it's just a way of differentiating yourself from the private sector and the state, rather than charity, which again is very Victorian. I also think that you have to demonstrate that the sector is forward thinking at a time when people are really wrestling with an immediate crisis. The sector has to say, this is the kind of society that we want, and this is how we recommend achieving it. And it has to be a unified message. And then you coordinate that with the impact of the sector. Again, you don't want it just to be helping people survive. It's like that we've done this amount of work and this has changed people's lives. And so that may mean charities working together to demonstrate their collective impact and moving away from, as Jim has said repeatedly, the fragmentation, that together we do this. And that is what we achieve. And this is how it needs to be built upon. And that is where our end goal is. And that would differentiate the sector from, I think, the other two sectors and give it a role that is important because it'll be visionary.
Excellent. That's a really useful point, I think, to conclude on, Shana. Thank you very much for that. I would just like to thank everybody for the questions they sent in. I didn't get to all of the questions. And indeed, some of them did include the suggestion of the third sector as another title that could be used for referring to the sector instead of charities. But thank you very much to everyone who sent in questions. Just on my own behalf, before I depart, I want to say thank you very much to all of the contributors and everybody who's organised today's summit, because I think it's been really, really useful. I think there's been an awful lot more consensus actually today than we had anticipated, which I think is quite interesting. And maybe that's a kind of a hopeful message for the final summit to end on. On that point now, I'm going to hand over to Ivan Cooper, who's the head of policy, and he's going to have the task of concluding our session this morning and doing the final thank yous. But on my own behalf, thank you very much. I've really much enjoyed facilitating the session this morning. Over to you, Ivan.
Okay, thanks very much, Inez, and thank you so much to Kitty, to Jim and to Shana. A really, I have to say, wide-ranging and comprehensive conversation that I do believe has surfaced most of the issues that the sector does need to attend to. I've been riveted by the conversation. There's huge amounts of ground covered. Just some points. You know, the crucially important work of the sector has come through really strongly. Kitty suggests that we're doing work that is not done by anybody else. How the role is championed into the future, the role that we perform in the sector is crucial. There is a moment where if we can marshal the arguments for equality, Kitty says, it's up to the sector to push those arguments and lead at the political level. So getting more political and campaigning, taking forward arguments for a more equal society. This relationship between the role the sector plays and equality and inequality, I think, is important. The delicate and difficult balancing out in restoring the health of the economy and the health of the nation. Jim prioritizes and notes that it's not binary. The economy and society are entwined, two sides of the same coin. And we need to build an economy that generates the resources to support the functioning society. But as Shana notes, we need to address the structural inequalities in the economy in the doing of that. It's not just about business as usual. And Jim noted the inequality situation, in his view, will be exacerbated unless, of course, we take action to ensure that it isn't, okay? And he notes that those hit most by the economic collapse are in low-paid work. Jim notes that his cynicism about community spirit. I think there's a challenge for us in the sector. Can we as a sector do more to surface and promote the reality of community spirit and the way that did indeed come to the fore? Is there something we can do there? And everyone agrees the situation cannot be, the way through this is not about austerity. We have to grow the economy, addressing the structural issues in the economy, and invest in public services as the way forward, and achieve a much greater focus on quality of life. The structures of public services then came up as a key issue, and I think that's something that we definitely need to look at, the role that we play in the sector in public services effectively. Shane challenged us to make sure that we don't become a sector that plays its part and perpetuates low-wage labour, and that we really need to look at making the sector a better place to work. So my kind of concluding observations, the sector, what's come through is very loud and clear. The sector effectively is providing core essential services in Ireland, in addition to the advocacy and the campaigning work that it does. In doing this, the sector is insufficiently and insecurely funded and has evolved in a piecemeal fashion through no fault of its own, being subsequently often blamed for the fragmentation in the way we do services in Ireland. So the sector is thus perhaps arguably playing an unintended part in a current unsustainable public services settlement. And we're arguably perpetuating inequality and insecurity of citizens. So a huge question there. I think the structure of public services and the role the sector plays, and how the sector is adequately funded to perform that crucial function and enabled to support people to participate in the design and control of their services is key on the way forward. So yet in saying that, the CV sector also brings, and especially brought during the COVID crisis, a people and community focused energy and support to its crucial and essential work. So how can we in the sector ensure that when we do things best, that person-centered and community-centered approach actually serves as a model for how we more generally do public services in Ireland? And so rather than having reform done to us, let's participate in a more wide-ranging review of how we do public services in Ireland. So how can we as a sector rise to the challenge posed by Kitty to get more political and win that PR battle to address inequality? How can we change the paradigm to ensure that we're treated and funded as essential services when we're doing that work? And how can we ensure that the sector, as Shana noted, does not become focused on meeting extreme basic needs as has happened in the UK? And how can we achieve the balance that Jim suggests is needed between the economy and society? So in conclusion, I have just some points that I'd like to make in relation to the messages that we've heard. This is the fourth in our series of virtual summits. We're absolutely delighted and honoured at the amount of participation that we've had from members. We're looking at building on this in the period ahead on the paper that we circulated, a discussion paper about the future of the sector. We'll be drafting that into a vision, really, on behalf and with our members of society and the economy, building on all of these engagements we've had, the first, second, third virtual summits and today's concluding one, and all of the engagements we've had over the years. So I think core elements of that will be, we need to ensure there's no return to austerity. The focus must be on investment in the economy and services, and we need to address structural inequalities in our own economy, and that it's not a return to some previously existing economic normal. We need to campaign more for an equal society with high quality public services and accept our leadership responsibility in the sector, the subsectors in the sector, and the wheel in particular in the context of today. We need to accept our leadership responsibility in this work, as otherwise we may be, as I've indicated, unwittingly participating in the perpetuation of inequality through our work. We need to demand and secure recognition of the essential nature of the work that we do. This is a really strong theme, and secure a new approach to sufficiently and securely funding this essential work so that workers are paid commensurate with the essential nature of their work. And that's something that came through really strongly in the COVID crisis. It became clear the distinction between what is truly essential work and perhaps what society traditionally has understood as essential work. And we need to make sure that we avoid, as Kitty suggests, appearing as a cap-in-hand sector. So solidarity of all the sector is needed here. We need to promote and raise awareness of the extent of the work being done and the impact, to use that word that Shana pointed towards. And we need to do work to gather that data, and we need to show the impact and the community spirit then that's underpinning that, to promote that and make it visible. And we need to finally, we need to achieve a new approach, I think, to partnership working with the state at all levels, Inés, so that the orientation of the sector can turn perhaps from the sticking plaster responses to more advocacy for change. And how can we radically engage at a local level? Much more focus on it needed there, coming through again in the conversation there, to support the circular economy and the new ways of doing things that will be needed to address the challenges ahead. So in my final observation, is it a utopia for society? And I think it's an interesting point that Jim made, that our objective is to put us all out of business. So is it that, or is it not, to try to involve through civil society, mediated by the community and voluntary sector, all people and citizens in shaping the future through enabling their full participation in society, economy, and democracy? I don't think that'll ever go away. And the way we do things in the community and voluntary sector, I think, indicates possibilities for the way ahead. If we can escape the challenge of funding paradigm. So lots of other, I think, fantastic material there today. In conclusion, we will be circulating, of course, the discussion this morning has been recorded, so that will be made available to all participants and indeed to anybody else who's interested in following the proceedings. As I've indicated, we'll be producing a paper to lead discussion on the way forward, building on the draft discussion document that we circulated over the last number of weeks to members, and building, I might add, on the Participating People report, just to give it a little bit of a plug there, that we did with Carnegie UK Trust, which identifies a whole range of very progressive initiatives, including the universal basic income that's been mentioned, and the new quality of life indicators that have been also mentioned today, and which are in the programme for government. We'll be looking to produce this draft discussion paper and present it as a calling card to the new government, if and when formed, and in any other context that may develop over the next few weeks. And we'll be working extremely hard to work with our colleague networks and federations in the community and voluntary sector, and with subsectors in the sector, to try and provide that leadership, because I think it's actually an imperative on us at this point to provide an alternative vision for society, which we believe is possible, as has been demonstrated during the COVID crisis itself, when we put the needs of society above the immediate needs of the economy. So we'll be circulating that paper in the next few weeks. And I'd also just like to note that we have a range of ambitious campaigning proposals and initiatives coming up. We'll be looking immediately at focusing in, as if and when a new government is formed, attention will turn quickly to the budget. There is a lot of positive stuff, we believe, in that programme for government, if a new government is formed, that we can build on. The quality of life indicators, as referred to by Jim, are in there, and lots of other stuff. And I'd advise you, if you'd like to understand more the relevant material in there for the community and voluntary sector, visit the Wheel's website, where we have produced a summary of that. So in absolute conclusion then, I would just like, on behalf of the Wheel, to thank Inés for so successfully chairing and facilitating our panel discussion. I'd like to thank from the bottom of our heart our three contributors, Kitty, Jim and Shana, who I think have provided us with really, I think it's been a full and complete coverage of the core and key issues which the sector faces. And we've heard it from three people who are, to a certain extent, in a position where they're able to, although they understand the sector, they can give a critical kind of a view of it. It has been an interesting critical assessment of the key issues going forward. And there's lots, of course, for us to think about in relation to how we do things in the sector itself. And our paper, the discussion paper, will identify those matters too. So we've run a little bit over time, but I would like to thank you for sticking with us during this process. And it's my job now to formally bring the virtual summit and the series to a conclusion. And thank you all, most importantly, in addition to all of our contributors, to thank our members for participating in this extraordinary series of events, and just simply to invite you to stick with us as we move on from here, attempting to provide leadership with and for the sector. This is all about solidarity, and that's the way we propose to progress. So without further ado, thank you very much for attending our sessions, and we in the Wheel are all very much looking forward to engaging with you further in the period ahead. Thank you, and goodbye.